Romana twirled the silvery necklace around her right index finger with a careless disregard. Her attitude belied its incredible value. The rays of the baking sun reflected glaringly from the sizable beads threaded upon a slender chain of the same chrome-like material. The doctor handed over a large gold coin to the reptilian owner of the market stall they stood at, one of many jammed into the market square of Shivish. Shivish itself was a significant settlement with its own spaceport on the planet of Zardil. Zardil, in turn, was roughly three-quarters desert, reaching from the equator to fairly high latitudes, which suited its reptilian populace very well. Romana stared around the market, with its dizzying array of goods and merchants, buyers and beggars, looking beyond them all to the low, single-story buildings of the settlement itself. The buildings were largely covered in daub and predominantly whitewashed. Further out, rising above the low profile of Shivish, some of the larger dunes of the surrounding desert could be seen, their near-white sands almost painful to look upon under such intense daylight.
What an amazing, vibrant world.
Romana gasped delightedly. The doctor looked around, then shrugged. If you say so. Reminds me of Earth.
What?
Romana cried incredulously, laughing. Yes, the doctor said, nodding to himself. Tunisia, I think. Romana snorted.
Nonsense. You can't go around pretending you've seen everything, done everything, every time we go to a new planet.
The doctor said nothing, stuffing his hands into his pockets, and simply stared off into the distance as a lone battered hovercar passed slowly by them. Romana was momentarily distracted by this, but then turned her thoughtful gaze upon the doctor.
Have you been here before?
The doctor gave a sad smile. I had a friend from here, he explained wistfully. A long time ago. He died far, far away, billions of years in the future. Romana studied the doctor for a moment before throwing the necklace to him in an effort to shift the mood. The doctor was caught by surprise, but was able to catch the jewellery nonetheless.
Well, that was surprisingly easy to find, all things considered,
Romana said, nodding to the collection of silver balls. The doctor sniffed airily. Hardly surprising. We are Time Lords, after all. Validium does not have the same value to all civilizations. Not everyone uses it to power their space vessels. To some it is merely decorative. With the whole of time and space open to you, even if currently only a fragment of it, it's not exactly difficult to find such a place. Romana raised a signature eyebrow.
Indeed. It makes you wonder why we spend so much time on Mondas.
The doctor rounded on her, frowning. A simple mistake, easily made and easily rectified, he snapped.
Oh, very easy. Hardly any time at all.
Romana responded with gentle mockery. The doctor harumphed. Then he shrugged and sighed. Of course, time is of the essence. I suppose we should install this in K9 post-haste. With that, he strode towards the nearby incongruous blue box and opened the door. With unusual and slightly insincere politeness, he held it open for Romana to enter. With her own teasing curtsy, she duly obliged. K9 sat upon the floor with his maintenance panel on his side wide open, myriad cables spilling forth. The doctor lay on his own side next to him, hand stuffed into that same hatch in the robot's flank, sonic screwdriver in his mouth. Almost there, he said, slightly muffled by the screwdriver. Then he withdrew his hands and grabbed the device from his mouth. Ha! He exclaimed, before pointing the screwdriver briefly inside K9 and activating it. He then, somewhat cavalierly, stuffed the remaining innards of K9 back inside and slammed the maintenance hatch firmly shut. There, K9. Everything feeling shipshape? Affirmative, Master. Excellent, excellent. There's a good boy. Never doubted it for a second. Affirmative, Master.
K9,
Romana chimed in.
can you now detect the rest of the FDSS, the four-dimensional stress set? And if so, do so,
She added hurriedly. Affirmative, Mistress. K9 responded, before beginning to chatter, whir and flash to himself. This went on for several minutes, while the doctor and Romana looked at each other with increasing concern. Location identified, K9 suddenly reported.
Where?
The doctor and Romana cried together. Coordinates 3691. Romana and the Doctor dashed over to the same panel of the main console, running into each other, shoulder to shoulder as they arrived. They both stared at each other for a moment before Romana gestured for the Doctor to access the controls. The Doctor nodded graciously before entering the data. He said thoughtfully. Janus. About 175,000 years in the future from our current location.
I suppose we were very lucky it was in our fragment of space-time after all.
Romana commented.
But you know this planet, Janus. You've been there before.
Of course, I remember it well. I've been there before. After all, I hid the FDSS there. The Doctor scoffed. Romana raised her arms in exasperation.
If you remember hiding it there, why on Gallifrey did we bother getting the Validium for K9?
The Doctor looked awkward and a little embarrassed. Well, I remember the planet. I just have no memory of hiding the FDSS there. Or where on Janus I may have done so. K9 will come in very handy, I suspect. Romana looked less than impressed, but accepted his explanation. The TARDIS had materialized in a small clearing in a dense tropical jungle. The sun must have been nearing the horizon, but, as the Doctor and Romana emerged from the doors of the police box, it was already hidden by the massive trees surrounding them. We had best wait until morning before setting out, the Doctor advised solemnly.
But why?
Romana said impatiently, almost pouting.
K9 has given us the local coordinates.
Because, the Doctor responded, all the apex predators are nocturnal on Janus. He then stiffened and stared off into the distance. The trial of patience, he said faintly.
The what?
Romana asked. The Doctor shook himself as if awakening from a trance. Sorry, I don't know what just came over me. The phrase just suddenly popped into my head. I wonder who left it there.
Who indeed?
Romana responded wearily, with a raise of her eyebrows. Together they returned to the safety of the TARDIS. In the morning, Romana was first to arrive back in the main console room. She was dressed as before, in her light cream dress and leather boots. She turned as she heard the Doctor enter the room and laughed.
Doctor, what are you wearing?
The Doctor was still wearing his typical black suit and Doc Martens, but over this he had draped a long, thick brown coat, and was carrying a large white fur rolled up under one arm. He simply gestured towards the stairs and the main doors. Romana climbed them and strode outside. Romana had only taken 2 steps beyond the door when she stopped, frozen in her tracks. Indeed, she now shivered and hugged her own shoulders while her breath steamed in front of her. The Doctor stepped out of the TARDIS behind her and handed her the fur he was carrying. The trial of preparation, he said with a quizzical expression, before smiling and shrugging.
What happened?
Romana asked as she hurriedly wrapped herself in the Doctor's gift. Nothing happened, the Doctor responded, still smiling. It's just a new day. Behold the 2 faces of Janus, he continued, holding his arms aloft. The seasons here are very binary and very fast. Just a day, in fact. One for summer, one for winter. The jungle, you see, is far more robust than your average rainforest, and perfectly adapted to these extremes. Romana looked around at the palm-like trees, strewn with creepers, all now covered in a thick layer of snow.
Well,
she said briskly,
K9 gave us the bearing and distance, so let's waste no more time.
With that, Romana marched off into the forest. The Doctor ambled behind. After an hour of pushing their way through icy damp vines and squeezing through the dense snow-covered undergrowth, they finally emerged at another clearing. The sight before them was quite breathtaking. A ziggurat filled this large open space and reached up high above the trees. Each tier of blocks was well over the height of a man. However, it was not the scale which was its most striking feature. Each block, every last one throughout the entire structure, was made of highly polished gold.
A little garish, isn't it?
Romana whispered to the Doctor. He gave a single laugh. Ha! Not in the eyes of the Argons.
The Argons?
Romana asked.
Are they the builders?
The Doctor nodded. They were, yes, but their civilization is long gone, millennia past. Apart from ourselves, there is no intelligent life on this planet. They walked towards the monstrous metal mountain, feeling ever more dwarfed as it loomed over them.
It looks like it was built yesterday.
Romana remarked. Well, yes, gold persists, the doctor noted before adding, at least when there's no one left to steal it. There was no obvious sign of an entrance at ground level, and so the doctor began to scan it with his sonic screwdriver. There appears to be at least one chamber deep within the ziggurat, but there are no passages leading to it from ground level, just a single shaft from the very top of the pyramid. Romana looked at the first tier of blocks immediately in front of them, taller than their heads.
Not an easy climb,
Romana said with some concern. The doctor cupped his hands together and nodded invitingly to them, his head then cocked to one side. The trial of friendship, he said distractedly to himself. He then shook his head as Romana accepted his leg up and was boosted to the top of the first block. Polished gold offered far from the best grip, and being further covered in snow and meltwater did nothing to improve things. However, with care and cooperation, the Time Lords at last stood together on the penultimate level of the pyramid. A single gold block stood before them, forming the pinnacle of the structure.
The shaft must be under that,
said Romana.
But how can we shift it?
The trial of strength, the doctor intoned, but sounded a little uncertain. I mean, we are both Time Lords. Together we should be able to slide it, shouldn't we? Romana shrugged non-committally, but placed her hands on the side of the block nonetheless. Together they began to push, but immediately found themselves slipping and sliding, at various points onto their knees or backsides.
This is hopeless,
Romana cried in despair. The doctor was sitting where he had just fallen, looking equally despondent. His face suddenly brightened. The trial of cunning, he cried excitedly, before leaping to his feet. He whipped out the sonic screwdriver and began to run it over the surface of the block they were standing on. The tip was actually touching the gold as he went, and the high-intensity emissions were scoring the surface. Eventually the doctor had managed a crisscross pattern over a large portion of the block's surface. Shall we give it another go? The doctor suggested. Once more they put their back against the block and heaved. Two ordinary humans would never have stood a chance of moving tons of gold. But these were no ordinary humans. These were Time Lords. The block remained motionless. Still heaving and straining, Romana held out her hand and gasped,
The sonic screwdriver! Quick!
While continuing to exert himself fruitlessly against the gold cuboid, the doctor reached into his jacket and passed her the device. Never once releasing her pressure upon the block, Romana placed the tip of the screwdriver against its surface. It began a low-frequency hum. Suddenly the block slipped forward. Both Time Lords lost their grip and fell on their rears. The vibrations had overcome the static friction, which had allowed the lump of polished gold to move enough to reveal a gap. The gap was barely a foot wide, but sufficient to allow them access to the shaft below.
The trials of strength and cunning,
Romana exclaimed, laughing, as she handed back the sonic screwdriver. She nodded down at the pattern the doctor had scored, then back to the now shifted block.
And friendship, I'd say,
Romana continued, smiling. The doctor indulged her with a small smile. A fair assessment, he conceded. He now leaned and peered down the shaft, illuminating it as best he could with the sonic screwdriver. There seems to be a ladder cut into the side of the shaft. As long as we are careful, it should be safe enough.
In that case, after you,
Romana said, gesturing theatrically at the narrow opening. The doctor slipped the screwdriver into a belt loop on his large brown coat, so that its feeble illumination could still be seen as they descended. This left his hands free to maintain his grip upon the disturbingly polished golden ladder. Romana, hands similarly unencumbered, followed just above the doctor. With constant vigilance and care, their journey continued uneventfully until they were nearing the bottom of the pit. At this point they noticed light filtering up from its depths, faint at first, but growing steadily as they approached. Finally, the doctor's head arrived at the ceiling level of the room below.
What can you see?
Romana hissed from above. Well, the doctor began cautiously, I can see the other half of the FDSS.
What?
Romana cried.
As simple as that?
Not exactly. You'd better come down and have a look. The doctor climbed down the last few rungs to the floor, allowing Romana to do the same. The room before them was sizable, but not cavernous, being perhaps 25 metres long and half as much wide. On the far side of the room there was a small gold plinth, and barely visible atop it, a small silver crown-like object. The other half of the four-dimensional stress set. However, between the Time Lords and the device lay a potential problem. Half the floor was missing. The entire middle section from side wall to side wall. In its place was a strange lattice of beams of a white marble-like material. 3 white circles, about a foot in diameter, marked where the lattice began on the side closest to the Time Lords. 3 similar pads marked its termination on the far side. From each pad sprang 2 narrow white walkways of the same material, leading forwards at 90 degrees to one another. Where walkways intersected, there was another small round pad. The doctor walked towards the edge of the lattice, Romana following. He mused, peering past the lattice into the void below. I can't make out the bottom. Before Romana could answer, there was a strange flashing accompanied by a crackling sound, like faulty electrical equipment. Suddenly, beside the doctor and Romana, stood the doctor. Ole, ole! Doctor, stranger! Met well, met well! The new vision of the doctor cried excitedly, flickering and shifting in position as he spoke. The real doctor put out his hand and waved it through the apparition, which wavered in response but offered no resistance.
It's a hologram,
Romana pronounced.
Well, at least we know which one of you built all this.
As Romana said this, she gesticulated at the hologram, lattice and plinth beyond. The doctor frowned. Not necessarily, he said slightly grumpily. I may have repurposed some Argon technology already abandoned here. And I may have programmed or reprogrammed this hologram just to mimic whatever form I had when I returned. Romana frowned.
But you don't remember any of this.
Romana's tone was dubious. The doctor looked awkward. Unfortunately not. I won't deny that would have been useful.
You seem to have done a sloppy job with the hologram,
Romana noted, nodding at the juddering image. So it would seem, the doctor replied, lost in thought. Then he turned towards the nearest round plate at the start of the lattice and moved his foot towards it. Horses, your hold! Horses, your hold! The hologram cried. Vortex thee beware! The doctor froze, not placing his foot on the plate, but instead returning it to the safety of the floor.
Beware the vortex,
Romana said gravely. Indeed. The doctor agreed somberly.
Well, I understand its words,
Romana continued.
but what does it actually mean?
The doctor chuckled. I think you're asking the wrong me. What is the vortex? The doctor then asked of himself. The hologram clapped its hands in delight. Doogie Rev! Doogie Rev! It exclaimed. Invisible is Vortex thee. Move for move matches Vortex thee. Material organic loves Vortex thee. Death to it loves. Sad so. The doctor shook his head as he rearranged his thoughts.
You got the gist?
Romana asked, concerned. Of course, of course. The game is child's play.
Excellent.
Romana cried. And if we lose, we'll be vaporized.
Oh.
The doctor stroked his chin. The trial of death, he said distantly, then shook his head. I don't think the vortex, can move onto our space. Doogie Rev! Doogie Rev! The hologram cried, smiling manically. The doctor frowned at it and pursed his lips. However, he continued, if we move on to the pad occupied by it, it will respond to us, respond to our organic bodies, and disintegrate us. Romana looked grim, while the hologram jumped up and down clapping.
This seems very chancy,
was her assessment. Agreed, the doctor said, lost in thought. Suddenly he snapped his fingers, looking up. Cheeseburgers! He exclaimed, grinning.
What on Gallifrey do you mean?
Romana asked, exasperated. The doctor turned to her, still smiling. I've seen this game before. seen it defeated. Romana's eyes widened.
Your memory of this place has returned.
The doctor shook his head. Oh, no, nothing like that. But I've seen this set up before elsewhere. One cunning so-and-so got around the system by using food, a cheeseburger, I think. He threw it onto the pad ahead of him, and if it wasn't vaporized, he knew it was safe.
Oh.
Romana said as the realization hit her. Then she asked,
And do you have a cheeseburger?
The doctor looked crestfallen, and his shoulders slumped. He stuffed his hands roughly into the pockets of his coat in frustration. Then a grin slowly crept across his face, and his eyes rose to meet Romana's. Anyone for a jelly baby? He asked as he withdrew a paper bag from one of the pockets. Romana gasped.
Will it work?
Well, they are mostly made of gelatin, the doctor said confidently, which is basically meat. I can't see any reason why not. Romana sighed.
I guess there's only one way to find out.
The doctor nodded. Stay close to me. We'll have to move as one person from pad to pad.
Of course.
Romana agreed. And naturally, we mustn't fall off. Romana could not help but roll her eyes.
Naturally.
With that, the doctor threw the bag of jelly babies onto the pad he had almost put his foot on earlier. Nothing happened. The doctor and Romana moved onto the pad, the doctor retrieving the bag as they did so in one fluid motion. There they stood, the doctor at the front, while Romana stood up against his back, arms around his waist. Doogie Rev! Doogie Rev! The hologram exclaimed again excitedly. The doctor surveyed his choices, then threw the bag along the right-hand fork to land upon the pad there. Nothing happened. The doctor and Romana joined the bag, recovering it as they arrived. The doctor spread his arms wide as his balance went astray, but, after a moment or two of wobbling, was able to restore equilibrium. They both breathed a sigh of relief. This time the doctor chose the left fork. They were able to progress once more, bag intact. Now he chose right. So far so good. The doctor decided to throw right again. With a flash and a fizzing sound, the bag and jelly babies vanished, leaving behind just the faintest whiff of smoke. Romana looked over his shoulder.
There goes our safety net.
The doctor nodded silently. With nothing left to probe the way, the doctor took a deep breath, then the left fork, Romana at his heels. Nothing happened. There were now only 2 more rows of pads to go, one suspended in mid-air, the next attached to the floor on the far side. The doctor chose left again. Once again, they survived. There were now only 2 choices open to the doctor, the middle pad or the leftmost one. Lucky left, here we go, he said with a shrug. He strode bravely forward on the leftmost fork one final time, Romana dragged with him by the tails of his coat.
Yes!
Romana cried triumphantly as she realized they were in one piece. Yes, indeed, the doctor said airily. It was, after all, a relatively simple puzzle. Romana frowned and raised one eyebrow.
Well, you set it.
The doctor harumphed. Well, I mean simple by my standards. I'm sure the FDSS was safe from almost anyone else.
I'm sure.
Romana said, less than convinced. She then plucked the FDSS piece from the plinth and put it inside her sleeve. Seeing the part secure, the doctor turned back to the lattice to contemplate the return journey. Just then the hologram spoke up again. I hope you prepared well, it said, this time speaking normally. Then it vanished. The moment the hologram disappeared, a low rumble began. The intensity increased, and what little dust there was between the gold blocks of the building began to fill the air. I've got a bad feeling about this, the doctor proclaimed. Quickly, he then said to Romana. You must follow my lead, exactly. He hurried over to the far left of the lattice from their perspective, where the next row's furthest left platform hung in the air over 2 meters away. Do what I do, immediately after me, and do not stop. The doctor took 2 steps back from the edge. Then he ran forward and launched himself into the air. He landed on the platform, but used his momentum to jump to the next, in effect covering 2 rows at a time by jumping over the void. He continued on with another 2-row jump, feeling his body start to tilt slightly as he did so. He landed badly on the next platform and was forced to fling himself forward, arms outstretched for the last disc. His feet did not make the final platform properly, tripping him and sending him sprawling across the floor on the far side. He immediately rolled onto his back to see Romana make her own landing. Her arms flailed wildly as she began to topple backwards into the void. The doctor scrabbled forward on all fours and flung his arms around Romana's upper legs, pulling her towards him and away from the precipice. She tottered forwards and regained her balance. The doctor now leapt to his feet. "We have to climb fast!" Together they dashed towards the shaft they had climbed down earlier, the floor bucking and shaking quite violently by this point. The doctor quickly unthreaded his coat's belt, while Romana did the same with the sash around her waist. Quickly they tied these together to form a rudimentary safety rope, one end around Romana's right wrist, the other tied to one of the doctor's belt loops. They climbed desperately now, the vibrations threatening to shake their hands or feet loose at any moment. The doctor was just about to reach through the opening beneath the block forming the peak of the pyramid when he was suddenly jerked violently at his waist. He braced his hands against either side of the opening in a frantic attempt to retain his balance upon the steps. He looked down in terror to discover Romana had slipped back one rung, but had managed to catch herself just as the makeshift rope went taut. She nodded to the doctor and climbed back up to give him more slack. The doctor dived out of the hole and hauled Romana up after him. Now came an equally crazy sliding climb down the snow and slush-covered tiers of the pyramid. As they approached the lower tiers, they began to be overtaken by blocks thrown free and careening down to crash into the jungle below. Hand in hand, the doctor and Romana jumped from the last level and pelted headlong towards the tree line, blocks thundering to the ground around them. Only after they had put a couple of 100 meters between themselves and the ziggurat did they dare turn around to witness the destruction. Before their very eyes, the pyramid crumbled into ruin, the majority of the blocks falling inwards to be consumed by whatever cavernous space lay beneath the construction. At last, the rumbling died away to silence, leaving only a pit with a few blocks scattered beyond it, dust gently billowing outwards from the site. Romana turned to the doctor.
"We made..."
Her statement was cut short by a new rumbling sound. Muted at first, it quickly became a roar of heavy objects colliding. Blocks now began to spill out of the pit, whilst those which had been thrown clear began to roll and bounce out of the jungle, back towards that same pit. The Time Lords could hardly believe their eyes as the blocks began to collide and pile up near the pit. No, not pile up, stack! The blocks were arranging themselves. With surprising speed, the blocks arranged themselves quite deliberately back into tiers. The ziggurat was rebuilding itself. Finally, the last block, the one which had sealed the shaft, wobbled into place and then was still. Romana turned once more to the doctor, her eyes wide.
"It reset itself,"
she cried incredulously. The doctor scratched the back of his head, looking equally bemused. Romana frowned.
"It was like it was some sort of giant game. Do you think we were ever really in danger?"
she asked. The doctor considered her words for a few moments. As he did so, he unpicked the safety rope he was still clutching and handed Romana's sash back to her. As they both began to rethread their respective belts, the doctor finally responded. "A good question. It's hard to say. I mean, some games have some pretty serious consequences. Have you ever seen Formula 1? Romana shook her head. The doctor nodded. "You're lucky. It's an Earth game. Very boring. Lasts for hours. Nothing much happens. But every so often, someone dies."
"How awful,"
Romana exclaimed. "It truly is." The doctor agreed. "But who can say what was happening here? Maybe we could have been disintegrated, or crushed under a gold block. I guess we'll never know." Then a thought struck him. "Unless you'd like another go?" he asked, pointing to the pyramid. Romana chuckled ruefully.
"I'll pass. Let's just take our prize back to Canine and the TARDIS."
The two Time Lords retraced their steps back through the cold, damp jungle until they reached the small clearing in which they had landed. There stood the familiar blue box, near the thick trunk of one of the larger trees defining the edge of the glade.
I didn't realize we'd landed so close to the trees.
Romana noted idly. There is nothing wrong with my parking, the doctor responded huffily. He opened the doors of the TARDIS and strode through, Romana in his wake. As he reached the top of the stairs leading down to the main console area, he heard a strange scuttling sound of rapid movement. He managed to half turn his head in time to see a figure in black biker gear and crash helmet dash through the doors before they could close, arms outstretched towards Romana. Romana must have heard the stranger's approach, as, with a dodge and a twist, she was able to grab her assailant's arm and throw her over her shoulder. Straight into the doctor. The doctor and the stranger both tumbled down the hard steps to land in a heap at their base. For the moment, the stranger was unmoving, but the doctor began slowly to struggle to his feet. He had only reached his knees, however, when he was knocked to the floor again by an agonizing wave of sound. This sonic attack almost robbed him of consciousness, and he lay upon the floor gasping, racked by excruciating pain. As this was occurring, K9 had been emitting a strange buzzing noise. Through the torture, the doctor was dimly aware of him crying, "Master, I am paralyzed! Master! Master!" The sound ceased. The doctor summoned the dregs of strength necessary to raise his head, enough at least to look up the stairs to where Romana still stood, looking down. In her hand was a sonic screwdriver. "Romana!" the doctor gasped. "What are you doing?" Romana laughed now, long and hard and cruel.
Romana, Romana, Romana. Oh, how I shall not miss the name.
"What are you saying, Romana?" the doctor cried weakly. Romana glared down at him now.
My, you are a dimwit, aren't you?
She spat contemptuously.
You still don't get it, do you?
Here she pulled herself up to her full height, chin raised.
I prefer to be called by my full name,
she said haughtily.
You may call me the Rani.
The doctor's vision swam now as the shock hit him in his already weakened state. With an effort he managed to focus upon the Rani once more. "Why?" the doctor gasped hopelessly.
Why?
The Rani said imperiously.
Why pretend to be Romana? Why incapacitate you now?
"Yes," the doctor affirmed feebly. "That's exactly what I mean." The Rani chuckled mirthlessly, and as she did so, she kicked her heel back against one of the roundel panels in the wall near the floor. It popped open to reveal a small cupboard. From there she withdrew a black backpack, while continuing to talk to the stunned doctor.
Well, it might please you to hear not everything was a lie.
She began.
I mean, when I first discovered the entire universe had shattered, I reasoned if anyone, other than myself of course, were likely to find a solution, it would be you.
Here she withdrew a large textbook from the cupboard and placed it in the bag. It was the Gallifreyan text they had discovered on Mondas in the bulk worshipper's temple.
I knew you would never work with me directly, never trust the Rani.
She continued.
So, I broke into Romana's residence, stole a few of her old clothes, styled my hair to something you would find familiar, and did indeed to side-to-side time transport to arrive in your TARDIS.
At this point, the Rani withdrew a small brass sphere from the cupboard. "Where did you get that?" the doctor cried. The Rani raised her right then left hands in turn.
The sonic screwdriver or the sphere?
"Both," the doctor responded curtly. The Rani inclined her head both obligingly and mockingly.
You might notice this screwdriver is not quite like your own. I believe it belonged to your third incarnation? I discovered it in one of your chaotic closets. In any case, it is rather handy.
"But what are you doing with the sphere?" the doctor rasped angrily. The Rani shook her head in mock regret.
Ah, here is where I fear you may lose all sympathy with my tale.
She began sadly.
Soon after joining forces with you, it became clear we were dealing with powers far beyond our own. So I began to formulate my own plan, using both the book and the second sphere, the one that was launched at us in the Mondas Parliament Library.
"Your plan?" the doctor gasped incredulously. The Rani placed the sphere inside the backpack, then heaved the bag onto her back, threading her arms through the straps. She stared then directly into the eyes of the doctor.
You know what they say. If you can't beat them, join them.
The doctor stared back at her in horror. Are you mad? The Rani laughed, then began leisurely to descend the stairs towards the doctor.
Oh, I don't think so. I'm as sane as I've always been, and I tend to remain that way.
At last she had reached the main console level and stood towering over the prone doctor.
I intend to force my way into their realm, into the bulk, to join their ranks.
But if you do this, force your way there, you will tear the universe asunder forever, destroy everything. The Rani shook her head.
Not everything. Just this pitiful four-dimensional bubble you inhabit. Oh, and everyone else in the universe, I suppose.
But you can't. The bulk. 11-dimensional existence. You will not survive it. It will destroy your mind utterly. The Rani looked down upon the doctor with scorn and contempt.
I told you before you underestimate the power of a Time Lord mind. With time and training, a Time Lord, with sufficient intelligence and drive, will be able to absorb the stimulus of 11 dimensions, and adapt to that existence. And I intend to give myself that time.
Now, the Rani walked over to K9. She withdrew the other crown-like half of the FDSS from her sleeve and placed it upon the robot's head.
But once my training is complete, I shall need this thing.
Here she nodded dismissively down at K9.
In order to forge my path into my higher realm, to immortal, extended, multidimensional power.
With this, the Rani gathered K9 under one arm and began to mount the stairs. Master! 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 I'm being abducted! Help me! Emergency! Master! K9 cried as he was carried away. The Rani stopped before the doors of the TARDIS and turned back to the other Time Lord.
Enjoy what time you have,
she said, smiling.
While you have it.
Then she walked through the doors with K9 and was gone. The doctor found the strength now to roll onto his front, and from there haul himself onto all fours. He crawled over to the stranger, still lying unmoving, spread-eagled upon her back. And it was plainly a woman. It also seemed highly likely to be the same woman who had attempted to run him over outside Foxgrove Cemetery. He reached over and carefully pulled off her helmet. Instantly he was on his feet, the helmet skittering across the floor. The adrenaline from the shock of the vision before him had utterly dispelled the after-effects of the Rani's earlier sonic attack. He instantly adopted the ancient Venusian Aikido stance as he stared down at the face before him. The hair was a little shorter than he was used to, but he could not deny what he saw. He stared into the face of the Rani.